The gavel struck the worn oak table so hard that dust motes scattered into the pale morning light streaming through the Millhaven courthouse windows, and Frances Brooks stood with her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone the color of fresh cream, because she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had already lost everything once, that the next few minutes would determine whether she lost everything again. The year was 1883, and the town of Millhaven, Texas, sat at the edge of the Llano Estacado like a stubborn splinter caught in the heel of a boot, small enough to know everybody's business and large enough to have enemies worth making. Frances had made plenty of those, not by intention, but by circumstance, and circumstance in Millhaven had a way of wearing a man's face and carrying a lawyer's leather satchel. That man was Clement Holt, attorney at law, representing the interests of the Holt family, who were also his family, which in Frances's mind constituted a conflict of interest of the most extraordinary kind. But Millhaven's circuit judge, the Honorable Raymond Aldridge, had heard the Holt name too many times at his dinner table to call it a problem. So there he sat on his raised platform, thick fingers folded across his considerable belly, looking every bit the part of a man already deciding how he would vote before a word of testimony had been offered. Frances had been widowed 14 months prior, when her husband Thomas Brooks had died of a fever that swept through the county like a grass fire in August. Thomas had been a good man, not a perfect man, she was honest enough to admit, but a good one who had worked the 80-acre parcel of land east of Millhaven's Creek Bend for 7 years, building it from raw scrub into something approaching a proper farm. He had grown sorghum, kept a small herd of cattle, planted a kitchen garden that Frances had tended with the kind of devotion most women reserved for prayer. When Thomas died, he left Frances with that land, a deed signed and filed at the county recorder's office, 2 horses, a milk cow named Josephine, and a daughter named Clara who had just turned 8 years old. He also left, without meaning to, a gap in the fence line along the eastern boundary, literally and figuratively, because the Holt family had been eyeing that creekside acreage for years, and the moment Thomas Brooks was in the ground, Reginald Holt had begun his campaign to take it. The dispute had started quietly, the way these things always did in places where men believed a widow would simply tire of fighting. Reginald had sent word that Thomas had owed him money, a debt of $240, he claimed, from a business arrangement made in the spring of 1881. He produced a paper. The paper had Thomas's name on it. Frances had never seen the paper before in her life, and she had managed every cent of the Brooks household finances because Thomas, God rest him, had possessed all the financial instincts of a man who believed the best place to keep money was inside his boot. She had hired a lawyer from Abilene named Mr. Potts, who charged her $30 she could barely spare and told her the signature looked genuine. She had stared at that paper for 3 nights running by lamplight, turning it in her hands, studying the loops of Thomas's letters, and she had known, in that wordless way that a woman knows the handwriting of a man she has slept beside for 9 years, that the signature was wrong. The T in Thomas curved differently. The B in Brooks leaned too far right. Thomas had always written his B with a slight backward tilt, a habit his schoolteacher mother had never been able to correct. But knowing something and proving it in a Millhaven courthouse were 2 entirely separate endeavors. So on this Tuesday morning in March of 1883, Frances Brooks stood in her best dark dress, which was also her only good dress, her brown hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck, her gray eyes steady, while Clement Holt laid out his case before Judge Aldridge with the smooth confidence of a man who had already been told the outcome over supper the night before. Clement was a lean, sharp-featured man of 42, with a silver watch chain that he touched constantly, as though reassuring himself of his own prosperity. He called his witness, a ranch hand named Devers who claimed to have been present when the debt agreement was struck, and Devers testified with rehearsed sincerity that yes, indeed, Thomas Brooks had borrowed the money, and yes, the signature was genuine, and yes, he had been standing right there. Mr. Potts cross-examined Devers with the energy of a man who had already given up but felt obligated to appear otherwise. Devers didn't budge. Judge Aldridge leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man nearing the end of a pleasantly predictable meal. Frances felt the cold truth of it settling over her like the shadow of a cloud passing over open country. She was going to lose. She could feel it the way she could feel weather coming in, a pressure behind her eyes, a tightening in her chest. Without the land, she had nothing. She would have to sell the cattle and horses, pull Clara out of school, take work as a laundress or a cook if she could find it, start over in some town where nobody knew her name. The double doors at the back of the courtroom pushed open. A man walked in. He was tall, not excessively so, but the kind of tall that fills a doorway without effort, and he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone accustomed to covering ground. He wore trail clothes that had seen real use, dark trousers tucked into worn boots, a canvas jacket over a clean flannel shirt, a hat the color of old saddle leather that he removed the moment he crossed the threshold. His hair was dark, nearly black, and he had the kind of jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the Caprock country outside. He was perhaps 32, 33, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into a Texas sun. He walked up the center aisle without apparent self-consciousness, while every head in the courtroom turned, and he addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said, and his voice was deep and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "I apologize for arriving late. I was told this proceeding started at 9. My name is Edgar Garrison. I rode in from the Dawes Range, and I have testimony relevant to this matter that I believe the court hasn't heard." Judge Aldridge looked at him the way he looked at things that inconvenienced him, which was with poorly concealed displeasure. "The testimony phase is nearly concluded, Mr. Garrison. Then I am grateful I arrived before it finished, Your Honor." Clement Holt was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This man is unknown to the proceedings. He was not on any witness list." Edgar Garrison turned to look at Clement Holt with an expression of polite patience. "I wasn't on the list because nobody sent for me. I heard about this case 3 days ago from a man at the Dawes outfit, and I came because I have direct knowledge of the facts in dispute. A court of law should want to hear direct knowledge." There was a ripple in the gallery. Judge Aldridge glanced at the murmuring crowd, and then at Clement Holt, and then at this large, unhurried stranger, and he performed the calculation of how it would look to turn away a witness in a case where a widow was trying to keep her farm. Millhaven had its share of Holt sympathizers, but it also had its share of ordinary people who did not like seeing the powerful feed upon the widowed. "Mr. Garrison," the judge said slowly, "I will allow you to testify on the basis that you can establish relevance immediately. Take the stand." Frances stared at this man she had never seen before in her life. He settled into the witness chair with the same unhurried ease with which he had entered the room, and Judge Aldridge nodded to Mr. Potts to conduct the examination, since the witness appeared to be on Frances's side of things. Mr. Potts blinked, rallied, and approached the stand. "Mr. Garrison, please state for the record your occupation and your connection to this matter." "I am a cattle drover and range manager, currently employed by the Dawes operation about 40 miles northwest of here," Edgar said. "My connection to this matter is that I was present in Millhaven in the spring of 1881, employed at the time by a ranching concern out of Lubbock County, and I have direct and clear knowledge of the circumstances surrounding Thomas Brooks and the nature of his financial dealings with Reginald Holt." The room had gone quiet enough that you could hear the wind moving along the eaves of the building. Mr. Potts, who had come alive in a way that suggested he had not entirely abandoned hope, leaned forward. "And what, specifically, is that knowledge?" Edgar Garrison looked at the judge rather than at Potts, which was either the habit of a man who understood how courtrooms worked or the instinct of someone who knew that authority needed to be addressed directly. In April of 1881, I was at the Southern Stock Exchange supper held at the Millhaven Hotel, the Cartwright Hotel, which was standing at that time before it burned in '82. Thomas Brooks was there. Reginald Holt was there. I was at an adjacent table for the better part of that evening, close enough to hear conversation clearly. He paused, not for dramatic effect but simply as a man who chooses his words. Reginald Holt approached Thomas Brooks about acquiring the Creekside acreage. Thomas Brooks declined. The conversation became pointed. At no point that evening did I observe any document signed or any money exchanged. What I did observe was Thomas Brooks telling Reginald Holt, plainly and without ambiguity, that his land was not for sale at any price, and Reginald Holt telling Thomas Brooks that he was making a mistake he would come to regret. The gallery produced a sound that was not quite noise, but was something between a held breath and a released one. Clement Holt was on his feet. "Your Honor, this testimony is hearsay and irrelevant. This man is claiming to recall a private conversation from 2 years ago. It is not hearsay," Edgar said calmly, still looking at the judge. "I am testifying to what I personally witnessed. That is by definition not hearsay, Counselor." Clement Holt's jaw tightened. Mr. Potts, emboldened, pressed further. "Mr. Garrison, in your observation, was there any indication that a debt agreement was reached or signed that evening?" "None whatsoever. I was close enough that had a document been produced, I would have seen it. What I saw was a man refusing to sell his land and another man who was angry about that refusal." "And the witness Devers, are you acquainted with him?" Edgar's expression shifted slightly, not to contempt but to something adjacent to it. "I know Devers. He worked for the Holt outfit for 4 years. He was not at the Cartwright Hotel supper that evening. I would have recognized him." The silence in the courtroom was complete. Judge Aldridge sat forward in his chair for the first time all morning, his fingers no longer folded comfortably across his belly but pressing flat on the table before him. He looked at Devers. He looked at Clement Holt. He looked at the gallery, which contained enough of Millhaven's citizenry to constitute a genuine jury of public opinion. He looked at Edgar Garrison and then, finally, he looked at Frances Brooks. Frances had not moved. She stood at her table with her hands still clasped, but the iron in her spine had shifted from the desperate stiffness of a woman bracing for impact to something else, something that felt startlingly like hope. Clement Holt cross-examined Edgar for 20 minutes with increasing aggression, and Edgar answered every question with the same measured directness, never raising his voice, never becoming rattled, never overreaching into territory he could not support with fact. He was like a man standing on bedrock. You could push against him all you wanted, but he simply did not move. When the cross-examination concluded, Judge Aldridge took a recess of 30 minutes, during which half the gallery filed outside to argue about what they had heard, and Frances stood alone at her table, too afraid to be hopeful and too honest to deny that something had changed. Mr. Potts appeared at her elbow, looking genuinely optimistic for the first time since she had retained him. "Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly, "that man may have just given you your farm back." She looked across the room to where Edgar Garrison stood near the back wall, hat in his hands, speaking quietly to no one in particular, simply waiting with the patience of a man who was comfortable with his own company. He had not looked at her once since leaving the stand. She found that either admirable or unsettling and wasn't sure which. When court reconvened, Judge Aldridge ruled. He ruled that the debt document presented by the Holt estate was insufficiently corroborated given the contradictory testimony of a credible witness. He ruled that the signature on the document could not be verified to the standard required to enforce collection. He ruled that Frances Brooks would retain full ownership of the 80-acre parcel east of the creek bend, that no lien would be placed upon the property, and that the court found no merit in the Holt claim sufficient to proceed further. He did not look at Clement Holt when he said it. Clement Holt's face was the color of a brick left in the sun. Frances sat down, which she had not intended to do, but her knees had decided for her. Clara was not in the courtroom. She was at school, as Frances had insisted, because she had not wanted her daughter to watch her mother lose everything. And for a moment Frances pressed both hands flat on the table before her and breathed in and breathed out and let herself feel the pure, staggering relief of it. When she rose and turned, she found the courtroom emptying around her. Mr. Potts gathering his papers with uncharacteristic energy, the gallery filing out into the bright March day. Clement Holt swept past her without acknowledgement, his hat clamped on his head and his jaw set with the particular fury of a man unaccustomed to defeat. She looked toward the back of the room. Edgar Garrison was still there. He stood near the double doors with his hat in his hands, and he was looking at her now, not the way men in courtrooms looked at women, appraisingly or dismissively, or with the particular calculation of someone deciding her value, but with a straightforward, quiet attention that reminded her, absurdly, of how Thomas's good dog used to look at her, with simple and complete focus. She walked toward him because it would have been unconscionable not to. He was the reason she still had a home. "Mr. Garrison," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected, "I owe you a debt I am not certain I know how to repay." "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Brooks," he said. "I only told what I knew. You rode 40 miles to do it." 43, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly in a way that was not quite a smile but was the precursor to one. "I got a late start." Frances studied him. Up close he was even more substantial than he had appeared at a distance, not in the way of a man who sought to impose himself, but in the way of a man whose presence was simply a fact, like a well-built fence post, practical, reliable, and not going anywhere. His eyes were a dark hazel, more green than brown in the courthouse light, and they were looking at her with that same steady attention. "How did you hear about the case?" she asked. "There was a man at the Dawes outfit, a hand named Whitfield, older fellow, used to work around Millhaven. He knew Thomas. Said he'd heard a widow was being taken to court over a debt that wasn't real, and that the Holts had the whole thing sewn up." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I knew what I'd seen at the Cartwright supper. It seemed like relevant information." "Relevant information," Frances repeated. "That is one way to describe riding 2 days to testify on behalf of a woman you've never met." "I suppose it is," he agreed, without apparent embarrassment. She did not know what to say to that. She had been a practical woman her whole life, the daughter of a Missouri farmer, raised to work before sunrise and after sunset, and to not indulge sentiment beyond what was useful. But standing in the emptying courthouse with this stranger who had just saved her farm, she felt something stir in her that she did not immediately know how to categorize. "I am grateful," she said, and meant it more completely than she had said anything in a long time. He nodded, accepting it without deflection or false modesty. There was a pause. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, and something in his voice had shifted almost imperceptibly. It was still the same measured, unhurried tone, but there was something underneath it now, something careful, the way a man steps onto thin ice with his weight distributed deliberately. "I realize we are strangers, and I mean this with every respect for that fact, but I wonder if you have no other engagement this evening, whether you might consent to join me for supper." Frances looked at him. She had not been asked to supper by anyone since Thomas died. She had not even fully registered that such a thing was possible until this precise moment, standing in a March courthouse with her farm still on the deed, and this steady-eyed stranger watching her with patient hopefulness. "Supper," she said, "at the hotel or at whatever eating establishment Millhaven has to offer," he said. "Nothing more than a meal, and I am aware that I have no standing to presume anything beyond that. I would simply like to know more about the woman who knew her husband's handwriting well enough to spot a forgery." That caught her. She had not said a word in court about the handwriting. "How do you know about that?" "Whitfield mentioned it. He said you were the one who first called it a forgery and that nobody believed you." The corner of his mouth moved again. "I believed you." Francis stood very still for a moment, with the feel of the March wind coming through the gap in the courthouse door, and the sound of Millhaven going about its Tuesday business outside. And she thought about all the reasons a woman in her position should decline: the town's opinion, the propriety of it, the rawness of still being in the first year and a half of widowhood, the practicality of a man who would be riding back to the Dawes Range in the morning. Then she thought about how it had felt to stand alone in that courtroom and believe she was losing, and how this man had walked through those double doors and told the truth out loud simply because it needed to be told. "The Millhaven Chop House," she said, "on 2nd Street, East Side. They have a decent beef stew and the proprietor keeps the place respectable. 6 o'clock if that suits you." Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not in the way of a man performing a motion, but genuinely, quietly, the way morning light changes when the sun clears the horizon. "6 o'clock suits me fine," he said. She nodded, put on her coat, and walked out into the March sunshine to collect her daughter from school and tell her the farm was still theirs. The Millhaven Chop House occupied a narrow building between the dry goods store and the harness maker on 2nd Street, and it was run by a woman named Mrs. Adeline Prout, who had been cooking beef stew and corn bread for Millhaven citizens for 11 years, and who took a dim view of anything she considered improper, which meant that the establishment had a reputation for both excellent food and rigorous decorum. It was, Francis had decided, exactly the right place. She arrived at 5 minutes to 6, having left Clara with her neighbor Mrs. Haggerty, who had listened to the day's events with the undisguised relish of a woman who loved a good story, and loved it even more when the villain lost. Clara had been cautiously delighted about the ruling and slightly suspicious about the supper, in the way that 8-year-olds are suspicious of anything that falls outside their established understanding of how things work. "Who is he?" Clara had asked, with her mother's gray eyes and her father's directness. "A man who did something kind," Francis had told her. "I'm going to thank him properly. That's what supper is for." "Sometimes, yes." Clara had considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved, and then asked if she could have the last piece of cornbread that Mrs. Haggerty was baking, which Francis took as acceptable closure of the subject. Edgar was already at the chop house when she arrived, standing outside rather than inside, which she noted. It was the kind of thing Thomas had always done, waited outside so she wouldn't have to navigate a room alone. The observation created a small ache that she acknowledged and set aside. He had changed his clothes. Not dramatically, he was still a working man and dressed as such, but he wore a clean dark shirt and his jacket was brushed, and he had clearly made an effort, which meant something to her, because effort was a language she understood. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, and held the door. "Inside, Mrs." Prout showed them to a corner table with the particular expression of a woman cataloging every detail for future reporting, and Edgar pulled out Francis's chair without making a production of it, which she also noted. They ordered the stew and the corn bread and coffee, and for a moment after the ordering there was the particular quiet of two people who do not yet know each other but are about to try. "You have a daughter," he said. It was not a question. "Clara, 8 years old. She has opinions about most things." "That seems right for 8, he said. "She asked who you were. What did you tell her?" "A man who did something kind." Francis wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Which is true as far as it goes." "It's about as far as I can claim at this point," he said, and there was something self-aware in it that she liked. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Garrison," she said. "You know more about my circumstances than seems fair." So he told her, and she listened, and it was the kind of telling that a person does when they are being honest rather than impressive, which was its own kind of impressive. He was from east of Amarillo originally, the son of a rancher who had died of a heart condition when Edgar was 22, leaving a modest operation that Edgar had run for 2 years before a particularly bad drought and a cattle epidemic had reduced it beyond recovery. He had sold what remained, paid his father's debts in full, and spent the better part of the last decade as a drover and range hand, moving between outfits as the work demanded. He had been at the Dawes operation for going on 3 years, which was longer than he had stayed anywhere, and he said this not with pride but with the mild note of a man observing something about himself that he had only recently begun to examine. "You never married?" Francis asked, and then immediately felt the question was too direct, but he didn't seem troubled by it. "No, the life doesn't lend itself to it. Too much moving." He paused. "Though I think the moving has been as much a choice as a necessity if I'm honest about it." She appreciated the honesty. "You are in the habit of being honest." "I try to be. It saves considerable complication." "It does," she agreed, "though it doesn't always save you from trouble. I was honest about the forgery and nearly lost my farm over it." "Nearly," he said. "Nearly," she conceded. The stew arrived, and they ate, and somehow the food and the ordinary mechanics of eating made the conversation easier, less weighted with the strangeness of the situation. She told him about the farm, about the sorghum crops and the cattle and the kitchen garden and the creek that ran clear in spring and nearly dry in August. She told him about Thomas, not in the careful way she talked about him to most people, but in the fuller way, the way that acknowledged his goodness and also his frustrations and the full complicated texture of a marriage that had been real rather than perfect. He listened to all of it without rushing her or looking uncomfortable with the subject. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," he said. "He was," she said. "He would have liked you, I think. He respected directness." She looked at him across the table. "He would also have said that a man who rides 43 miles to testify for a stranger is either a saint or a fool." "Probably closer to the second one," Edgar said, and this time the corner of his mouth went all the way to a full, genuine smile, and Frances found herself smiling back before she had decided to. It was the first time she had smiled like that, the unguarded kind, in 14 months. The supper lasted nearly 2 hours, which was longer than either of them had planned and shorter than either of them wished. When they stepped outside into the cool March night, the sky over Millhaven was so thick with stars that it looked like someone had scattered salt over dark cloth, and the air smelled of cedar and distant livestock, and the particular clean cold of the Texas plains at night. They stood on the boardwalk in the manner of two people who are not quite ready for the evening to be over, but are uncertain about what happens next. "I'll be heading back to the Dawes Range in the morning," he said, and he said it straightforwardly, the way he said everything, without softening it into dishonesty or dramatizing it into tragedy. "I know," she said. "I'd like to write to you if you'd permit it." She looked at the stars for a moment. A letter was a small thing and also not a small thing at all. It was a thread, and threads once accepted had a way of becoming connections, and connections had a way of becoming something else entirely. "I would permit it," she said. He nodded, and something in his expression settled, like a man who has placed a careful bet and is satisfied regardless of the outcome. "Good night, Mrs. Brooks," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Mr. Garrison," she said, "and thank you for everything." He walked toward the livery stable where his horse was kept, and she watched him go for a moment, the long, unhurried stride, the set of his shoulders against the star-thick sky, and then she turned and walked toward Mrs. Haggerty's house to collect her daughter. The first letter arrived 11 days later. It was written in a clear, careful hand on plain paper, and it was not flowery or overwrought. It told her about the drive he had been managing north of the Dawes Range, about a particular stretch of country where the grass was coming in thick after the winter rains, about a conversation he had overheard between two cowhands about which was superior, a good mule or a reliable horse, and the extensive and earnest arguments both parties had deployed. It ended with a simple, direct question. How was the farm, and had the Holts attempted any further mischief? She wrote back the same evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Clara was asleep. She told him about the sorghum planting she was preparing, about a heifer that had gotten through the fence line and been found half a mile away, apparently inspecting the Haggerty vegetable garden with professional interest, about Clara's school play in which Clara had been assigned the role of a tree, and had taken this assignment with a seriousness that suggested she intended to be the finest tree the Millhaven schoolhouse had ever produced. She told him the Holts had been quiet, which she attributed partly to the court ruling and partly to the fact that Judge Aldridge's verdict had been discussed in some detail around Millhaven, and Reginald Holt was temporarily in the position of a man whose scheme had been publicly disassembled in front of witnesses. She signed it, "Yours faithfully, Francis Brooks." His second letter came within a week of her first, and her second went within a week of his, and somewhere in the fifth or sixth exchange, the letters grew longer without either of them apparently deciding that they would, the way a creek rises slowly, and then suddenly you notice that the banks are full. He told her about his father, and about the drought that had taken the ranch, and about what it had been like to stand on land that had been his family's, and know that he had to let it go. She told him about leaving Missouri at 20 with Thomas, newly married, heading into country neither of them had seen before, and how she had been terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, and how those two things had felt so similar that sometimes she had confused them. They wrote about the work of their separate lives, the particular problems of range management and the particular problems of a single woman farming, the mathematics of cattle prices and grain prices, the way weather could undo in 3 days what months of work had built, the small satisfactions of things done well. They wrote about books, because it turned out both of them read when they could get their hands on something worth reading, and about the minister's recent sermon which Edgar had attended at a small church outside the Dawes property on a Sunday, and which had apparently taken as its text a passage about the rewards of patience. He wrote, "I found myself thinking the minister had a point, though I could not have said exactly why at the time." She read that sentence 3 times and felt warmth move through her that she didn't try to name. In June, he wrote to say he would be driving a herd south, and that the route would take him within 20 miles of Millhaven, and he wondered, without pressure and without assumption, whether she might be willing to have him visit if he could arrange a day's leave from the drive. She wrote back, "The farm is easy to find from the Eastern Road. Clara has been asking about you. He arrived on a Saturday in late June." She heard the hoofbeats from the garden where she was pulling weeds, and she stood and pushed her hair back from her face with a wrist that was dirty from the earth, and she watched him ride up the track from the Eastern Road on a rangy bay horse, and something happened in her chest that she did not try to argue with. Clara was at the fence before Francis reached it, because Clara had inherited her mother's directness and her father's fearlessness, and combined them into something that occasionally alarmed Francis in its completeness. "Are you the man from the courthouse?" Clara demanded. Edgar reined in his horse and looked down at her with the same steady attention he gave everything. "I am," he said. "Mother said you rode 43 miles, Clara said. "Why?" "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. Clara considered this. "That is a lot of miles for a right thing." "Some right things are worth the miles," he said. Clara appeared to find this satisfactory and stepped back to allow him through the gate in the manner of a small person who had been conducting an interview and reached a provisional verdict. Frances found herself laughing, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the belly, and she saw the way Edgar's face opened when he heard it, the way his expression lost its characteristic reserve and became something warmer and more unguarded, and she thought, "Here is a man who smiles at the sound of a woman's laughter. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal." He stayed for the day. He helped her repair the section of fence on the eastern boundary that had been giving trouble, working steadily and competently, which she appreciated. He sat with Clara in the afternoon and answered her questions with patient seriousness. Clara had many questions, arranged in no particular order of importance, ranging from the mechanics of cattle driving to the relative intelligence of horses versus mules, to whether the moon was really made of what her schoolbook said it was made of. Edgar had opinions on the first 2 and admitted honest ignorance about the third, which satisfied Clara more than a confident wrong answer would have. In the late afternoon, while Clara was feeding the chickens, Edgar and Frances sat on the porch with coffee and looked out over the 80 acres that she had almost lost, the sorghum coming up green in the evening light, the creek glittering in the middle distance, the Texas sky doing what it always did in June, which was put on a display of color that stopped just short of improbable. "It's good land," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Thomas worked it well." "He did." She paused. "So do I," he looked at her with that hazel gaze. "I know you do, Mrs. Brooks. I didn't mean otherwise." "Frances," she said, "if we are on a first-name basis with the correspondence, I think you can manage it in person." "Frances," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, unhurried, like he was settling into it, like the word was a place he was deciding to live, that made her feel the warmth again, the unnamed warmth, and this time she decided to let it have a name. She was falling for this man. She did not say this. It was June, and he had been in her life since March, and the correspondence had been remarkable, and the day had been the best she had spent in longer than she could honestly say. But she was also a practical woman, a careful woman, a woman who had learned that the land stayed and people could be taken, and that hope required collateral. But she let herself feel it, quietly, privately, the way you feel morning coming before the light arrives. He left as the sun was going down, because he had to make camp with the drive. He shook her hand when he said goodbye, which made her smile because it was both perfectly formal and perfectly absurd given everything, and he knelt down to say goodbye to Clara, who informed him that he was allowed to come back. "I appreciate the permission," he said gravely. "I am giving it," Clara confirmed. He rode back down the eastern road in the long gold light of a Texas June evening, and Frances watched until the road bent and the trees took him, and then she stayed on the porch a little longer, listening to Clara's voice from the chicken yard, feeling the summer settling around her like a warm hand. He came back in August. He came again in October, this time for 3 days, having arranged leave from the Dawes outfit for reasons he described only as personal business, which caused considerable speculation among the cowhands at the Dawes range, but which Edgar did not elaborate upon. In October, the farm looked different than it had in June, the sorghum harvested, the kitchen garden winding down, the land taking on the golden-brown look of approaching autumn, the creek lower in its banks, the sky a different blue, harder and cleaner than the hazy summer blue. He arrived on a Thursday morning and stayed through Saturday. On Thursday evening, after Clara was asleep, they sat on the porch again with the oil lamp between them, and the conversation that had been building through months of letters and 2 brief visits found a different register, quieter, more honest, the kind of talk that happens when 2 people have been circling something and have decided to stop circling. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, without worrying about what I might want to hear." "That has generally been my policy," she said. "I know it has." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Do you think of what we are, what this is, as more than friendship? Or are you being kind to a man who helped you when you needed it, and I am confusing gratitude for something else?" Frances was quiet for a moment. The night sounds of the farm came and went, the occasional shift of the horses in the corral, an owl somewhere in the creek cottonwoods, the dry movement of grass in the light wind. "I have thought about this," she said carefully, "because it matters to think about it correctly. I was married for 9 years to a good man, and I loved him, and I was widowed, and widowhood has a particular texture that I think only women in it fully understand. There is grief in it, and also a kind of freedom, and also a kind of loneliness that is different from ordinary loneliness because it has a shape, a specific shape, the shape of the person who isn't there." He was listening the way he always listened, completely. "What I feel when I read your letters," she continued, "is not gratitude, or it is gratitude, but it is not only that, and the rest of it is not nothing. What I feel when you are here is not the performance of happiness. It is actual happiness." She looked at him directly. "I think you know the difference. I think that is what you are asking about." He was quiet for a moment that stretched out into the October night. "I am in love with you," he said, and the directness of it, the plain, unhurried directness, landed with more weight than any elaborate declaration could have managed. "I think I have been since about the third letter, and I have been trying to find the honest way to say it without making you feel as though I came riding in to rescue you and now expect something in return. I don't expect anything. I told you at the beginning that you owe me nothing, and that hasn't changed." Frances felt something move through her, something that was not quite tears and not quite laughter but contained elements of both, and she pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment and breathed. "Edgar," she said, "yes. I am not a woman who says things she doesn't mean. I know that. Then hear this plainly." She lowered her hand. "I love you too. I did not expect to, not like this, not in a year that started the way this year started. But here we are, and I would be a fool to pretend otherwise." He reached across the lamplit space between them and took her hand, and it was the simplest gesture imaginable, just his hand around hers, warm and certain, and it felt like the most significant thing that had happened to her in years. They sat like that for a while, with the October wind moving through the cottonwoods and the lamp casting its small circle of gold, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence was already full. "I have been thinking," he said eventually, "about what a life looks like that isn't a string of cattle drives and other people's ranges." "Have you?" she said, and her voice was warm. "I have. I have been thinking about it since about the fourth letter, if I'm honest." He turned her hand in his, carefully, the way a man examines something valuable. "There's a parcel of land north of here, 14 miles north, up near the Ramirez Creek country. I looked at it in September. A man named Creighton is selling it reasonable. It's good grass land and it has water. I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" she said quietly. "I thought that two adjacent operations, or one combined operation, with someone who knows sorghum and someone who knows cattle, might make a considerable thing out of the land around here." He looked at her. "I thought I wanted to stop moving. I thought the reason I wanted to stop was standing on a porch in October with her hand in mine and more sense than anyone I've met, and a daughter who gives permission the way a judge gives rulings." Frances laughed, the real laugh again, the belly kind, and she felt him squeeze her hand. "Is that a proposal?" she asked. "It's the beginning of one," he said. "The proper part comes later, when I have a ring and a less smoky lamp, and perhaps a moment when I am not terrified of the answer." "You don't seem terrified," she observed. "I have been told I conceal it well." He looked at her with those hazel eyes in the lamplight. "Is the answer likely to be favorable?" She looked at him, this man who had ridden 43 miles because it was the right thing to do, who had told the truth in a hostile courtroom without flinching, who wrote letters with the same steady care he brought to everything, who listened to her daughter's questions about the moon with the same seriousness he brought to fence repairs and cattle prices, who sat on her porch in October saying plain, honest things in the dark. "The answer," she said, "is going to be very favorable." He exhaled slowly, and she realized he had been holding his breath. "All right then," he said. "All right then," she agreed. The next morning, over breakfast, Clara looked between the two of them with the forensic attention of a child who has been listening for more than adults assume, and said, "Is Edgar going to stay?" Frances looked at Edgar. Edgar looked at Frances. "Not yet," Frances said, "but soon, if you are in favor of it." Clara considered this with great seriousness, turning her fork in her small hand. "He fixed the east fence," she said finally. "That fence has been trouble for a year." "It has," Frances agreed. "And he answers questions properly," Clara continued. "He does," Frances said. Clara looked at Edgar. "You can stay," she said, with the decisive authority of a small judge. "Permanently, I mean." "Thank you, Clara," Edgar said, and his voice had a quality in it that Frances had not quite heard before, a softness, a warmth that went below the surface steadiness, something that sounded a great deal like a man arriving somewhere he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. The next 3 months moved with the particular combination of patience and urgency that characterized everything Edgar did. He returned to the Dawes Range and gave his notice, which was received with disappointment by his employer and ribald commentary from the cowhands, who had correctly theorized the nature of his personal business. He arranged the purchase of the Creighton parcel north of Millhaven, 87 acres of grass country with good water and a modest but structurally sound house that needed some work, which Edgar began while simultaneously helping Frances with the winter preparations on her farm. He was in Millhaven most weekends through November, and the town noticed, as small towns will. Mrs. Prout at the chop house noticed. Mrs. Haggerty next door noticed and approved loudly. The minister at the First Methodist Church, a decent man named Reverend Calloway, who had officiated at Thomas's funeral, noticed and took it upon himself to tell Frances privately that he thought Thomas would have been glad to know she was not alone, which made her cry in a way that felt clean rather than sorrowful. Clement Holt noticed as well, and was reported by multiple witnesses to have expressed, in the interior of the Black Horse Saloon, his opinion that the whole situation was disreputable, which Millhaven largely received with the indifference it deserved, since Clement Holt's opinion had been comprehensively devalued by March's courtroom proceedings. Reginald Holt had been conspicuously absent from town since the ruling, which suited everyone. Edgar proposed formally on the first Saturday in December. He did it on the porch, which was their place by now, with a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small, plain gold band with a single garnet, and he went down on one knee on the cold December boards with the winter sky enormous and pale above them, and he said the words simply and directly in the way he said everything, and Frances said yes before he had finished the sentence. She wore the garnet ring, and it fit as though it had always been waiting for her finger. Clara was told immediately and declared this the best possible news, and then asked if she could be a flower girl, which Reverend Calloway later confirmed was entirely appropriate. They married on the second Saturday in February, 1884, in the Millhaven First Methodist Church, with a congregation of perhaps 60 people who included Mrs. Haggerty and Mrs. Prout, and the Dawes outfit foreman who had ridden down from the North Range, and Clara in a dress with actual flowers embroidered on the collar, carrying a small basket with dried winter flowers, because fresh ones were not available, and dried ones were honestly what the season had to offer, and Frances thought that was perfectly fitting. Frances wore her best dress, which was no longer the same dark dress she had worn to the courthouse. She had, in a small act of deliberate joy, purchased a deep blue wool dress from the dry goods store, the color of the sky just after sunset, and she stood at the altar with this man who had walked through her courtroom doors 11 months earlier and changed the direction of everything, and she felt the full weight of the moment and did not look away from it. Edgar, for his part, looked as he always looked, steady and present and entirely, completely there. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony with warmth and brevity, which Frances appreciated because she had told him she wanted God and meaning but not an address. When Edgar took her hand at the altar, Frances thought, briefly and without grief, of Thomas, of how he had stood in a different church in Missouri and done the same thing, and how she had loved him and been loved in return, and how that love had been real and complete in its time. She held that memory gently, like something you can put down without losing it, and then she looked at Edgar and she was present, fully present in the February church in Millhaven, Texas, in the year 1884, saying yes for the second time in her life to a man she trusted with everything she was. "I do," she said, and meant it with all of herself. He said "I do" in return, and his voice was steady, and his eyes were on her face, and he looked like a man who has found the thing he did not know he needed and intends to take excellent care of it. Clara threw the dried flowers with genuine enthusiasm and got a handful of them in Mrs. Haggerty's bonnet, which Mrs. Haggerty bore with only minimal complaint. They had a supper at the chop house afterward. The whole congregation was invited, and about 30 people actually came, and Mrs. Pruitt had outdone herself with roast beef and 3 kinds of pie and a wedding cake that was small but extremely good. And the evening went on longer than anyone had planned and was warm and loud with conversation and occasional laughter. And Frances sat at the center of it in her deep blue dress with her husband's hand covering hers on the table and felt, somewhere under all of it, the particular peace of a person who has come through a hard thing and arrived somewhere solid. They moved into the Creighton house on the Garrison parcel that spring, Edgar's land, as it was now legally titled, and the arrangement Frances and Edgar had discussed on the October porch took practical shape. The Brooks farm was leased to a hardworking young couple named the Parkers who had recently arrived in Millhaven with ambition and no land, and the lease income contributed to the Garrison household while the Parkers built toward eventual purchase. It was a practical arrangement that satisfied all parties, and Frances felt that Thomas would have approved of his land going to people who needed it and would work it well. The Garrison acreage ran cattle. It also, in its first spring, began to grow sorghum, because Frances knew sorghum and the land turned out to be receptive to it, and the combination of cattle income and grain income made the operation considerably more stable than either alone would have been. Edgar said, with the air of a man stating the obvious, that having a partner who understood what he didn't was rather the whole point of a partnership, and Frances kissed him, which he received with the particular expression he wore when she surprised him pleasantly, which was often. The Millhaven community settled around them with the practicality of small-town life. There were those who remained skeptical of a widow who had remarried less than 2 years after her husband's death, because there are always those people, but they were outweighed by those who simply thought Frances Brooks had earned whatever happiness found her way, and that Edgar Garrison was a man of evident character who had demonstrated as much in court. Clara thrived. She adjusted to the Garrison property with the adaptability of a child who is fundamentally secure. She missed her old house, but was practical about it in a way that reminded both adults of Thomas's clear-eyed pragmatism, and she occupied herself with the new arrangement with enormous enthusiasm. She had decided that Edgar was a satisfactory stepfather, which she communicated to him not in words, but by asking him to help her with her arithmetic homework, which was a form of trust that Edgar correctly identified as significant and treated accordingly. By midsummer of 1884, Frances knew she was expecting. She told Edgar on a June evening, on the porch of the Garrison house, their porch now, with a better lamp than the one at the farm had been and a clearer view of the creek country, and she watched his face move through surprise and something that was not surprise at all, but rather the arrival of something he had hoped for without letting himself be certain of. "A baby," he said. "In January, if my calculation is right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand, which was becoming their signature, this particular gesture, and she thought that some things between two people establish themselves early and stay like good fence posts. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am also somewhat alarmed because I know what this involves and I am not 23 anymore." "You are 31, he said. "That is not ancient." "Tell that to my back come December," she said. He laughed. His laugh was different from his smile, more sudden, less controlled, and she tucked it away in the collection she was building of things she loved about him. The baby arrived in late January, 1885, which was 1 month later than Frances had estimated, and which was, she informed Edgar during the considerable unpleasantness of the final hours, entirely his fault for making her optimistic. Reverend Calloway was called to be on standby, Mrs. Haggerty served as the practical anchor, and the Millhaven doctor, a competent man named Dr. Finch, managed the proceedings. It was a boy. They named him James Thomas Garrison, James for Edgar's father, Thomas for Frances's first husband, because Frances said plainly that Thomas Brooks had been part of making her who she was, and she would not pretend otherwise, and Edgar said he would have it no other way. Clara regarded her half-brother with the complicated expression of a 9-year-old confronting a loud, demanding new household member, and then she said, with the resigned authority she applied to most things, that he had Thomas's nose and it would probably suit him eventually. James was an excellent baby, which Frances noted with the pragmatism of a woman who had been through it before and knew that this was not guaranteed. He was solid and earnest and looked at the world with wide hazel eyes that were clearly his father's, and Edgar held him with the particular careful intensity of a man who has not held babies before and is determined to do it correctly. Frances watched Edgar hold his son and felt something settle in her so deep and so complete that she simply closed her eyes for a moment and let it be. The years that followed were the ordinary, extraordinary kind, full of the work of land and livestock and children and weather, and the 10,000 small decisions that compose a life. Edgar proved, as Frances had fully expected him to prove, to be exactly the same man in continuous proximity that he was at first acquaintance. Steady, direct, hardworking, possessed of a dry humor that emerged most reliably when something had gone wrong and a man of lesser character would have despaired. He was a good father, not a demonstrative one in the flashy sense, but present and consistent and honest with his children in the way he was honest about everything, which Clara eventually said was the most valuable thing about him. Clara, for her part, grew into a young woman of formidable competence and independence, who graduated from the Millhaven School in 1892 at the top of her class, and subsequently announced her intention to study at a women's college in Austin, which Frances supported without hesitation, and Edgar said was the obvious right course for a girl of her quality, and Clara packed her trunk with the decisive air of someone who had been preparing for this departure for years, which she had. James grew up with the land in his hands and the cattle in his bones, and Edgar's steadiness and Frances's determination mixed together in him, in a combination that generally manifested as an extremely capable young man of few words and considerable effectiveness. He was his father's shadow on the range from the time he could sit a horse, and he treated the sorghum fields with the respect due something his mother had built, which pleased her more than she usually let him see. Reginald Holt died in 1887 of a stroke at his own supper table, and Millhaven observed the news with the general absence of sentiment that the man had earned. Clement Holt had left Texas 2 years prior to pursue opportunities in the North, and his departure was similarly unlamented. The Holt family's influence in Millhaven diminished steadily through the late 80s as their political connections aged out of office, and their business practices came under the scrutiny of people less inclined toward accommodation than Judge Aldridge, who himself retired in 1886. The new circuit judge was a woman-raised man from Galveston who had studied law seriously, and who Frances thought had the kind of face that suggested he actually read the documents put before him. In the spring of 1888, Frances and Edgar had a second child, another boy, named William after no one in particular, but because it was a good solid name they both liked, and William arrived with considerably more speed and efficiency than James had, as though he had somewhere to be. The family was complete in the way of a thing that has found its proper dimensions. In the autumn of 1889, on an evening in October, always October, Frances thought, always this particular quality of October light, she and Edgar sat on the porch of the Garrison house with coffee and the view of the creek country going gold in the last of the afternoon, and James was somewhere in the south pasture with the cattle, and William was inside making noise with a set of wooden blocks that Mrs. Haggerty had given him, and Clara's last letter from Austin was on the table beside them. Full of news about her studies and a professor she found extraordinary and the particular freedom of a city after growing up in Millhaven. "Do you ever regret it?" Edgar said. She looked at him. "Regret what? The way things went. The trial, the letters, all of it. You had a life before me. You'd built it yourself." She thought about this seriously because he deserved a serious answer, and also because it was a question worth taking seriously. She thought about the courthouse in March of 1883 with her knuckles white and the verdict going the wrong direction. She thought about the double doors opening. "I regret Thomas dying," she said honestly. "I will always regret that. Not because I didn't find this, because he was good, and he didn't deserve to die young, and Clara deserved her father." She paused. "But the rest of it, the farm, the trial, you walking in through those doors, no, I don't regret any of it, not for a single day." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was receiving something, placing it carefully where it belonged. "I don't either," he said, "not for a single day." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the October light watching the creek country go golden, while inside the house, William knocked his wooden blocks over with a crash and laughed at the noise. The sorghum fields were in beyond the creek, stubbled down after the harvest, waiting for spring. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The sky was doing its evening thing, the hard, clean blue softening toward gold, toward orange, toward the first suggestion of stars. 43 miles had started all of this. 43 miles and a man who walked through a courtroom door because it was the right thing to do, and told the truth because that was what he did, and asked a widow to supper because he wanted to know more about the woman who had known her husband's handwriting. Frances thought, this is the shape of a life. Not the one she had planned, not the one she had imagined when she left Missouri at 20 with Thomas beside her, and the whole country opening ahead of them. A different shape, harder in some places, fuller in others, with seams where things had broken and been mended, and the mended places were their own kind of strength. She pressed her hand over Edgar's where it rested on her shoulder, and she felt him squeeze. "Edgar," she said. "Frances," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for riding 43 miles. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said in the dry, unhurried way that was entirely his own, "I had a late start." She laughed, the real laugh, the belly kind, the one that had started all those years ago in a courthouse vestibule, and he laughed with her, and the creek country held the sound of it for a moment in the October air before it moved on downstream, as everything does, leaving the evening clean and full and good. Clara's letter on the table said she had met a law student at the college who she thought was interesting, and that she was considering her options carefully, which sounded exactly like Clara. James came in from the south pasture at sunset, moving with Edgar's walk, and reported that the herd was settled, and the south fence needed some attention on the east corner, which was the Brooks Farms east corner's tendency passed to the next generation. William fell asleep on the parlor floor surrounded by his wooden blocks and had to be carried to bed, which Edgar did with the same careful intensity he had brought to holding James for the first time, because some habits of a man's character are permanent, and this one had always been one of his best. Frances sat alone on the porch for a few minutes after Edgar went inside, listening to the night settle around the Garrison place, the horses in the corral, the creek in the dark, the specific silence of good land at rest. She thought about everything the last 6 years had contained, everything that had happened from that March morning forward, and she was aware, with the plain, clear awareness of a woman who looks at things directly, that she was happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of someone who has never been hurt. Harder, more particular happiness of someone who has come through loss and found that on the other side of it, life continues to be worth having, worth building, worth loving the people in it with everything you have. She went inside. Edgar was in the kitchen, washing the coffee cups with the methodical care he brought to everything, and he heard her come in and looked up at her, and his face was exactly what it had always been, steady, present, entirely there. "Come to bed," he said. "You'll freeze out there." "It is October in Texas," she said. "It is 60 degrees. Come to bed anyway," he said. She smiled and hung up her coat and followed her husband through the lamplight of their house, past the parlor where William slept on the floor, and the blocks lay scattered like a small testament to a child's enthusiasms, past the framed embroidery that Mrs. Haggerty had made them as a wedding gift, past the bookshelf with its steadily accumulating collection, past the window where the last of the October sky had gone to dark, and the first stars had appeared as they always did. Reliable as anything good appearing in the dark, making the dark worth looking at. In the morning, Edgar would ride the south fence line and fix the corner. Frances would write a letter to Clara in Austin about the law student, because a mother's perspective on law students was a thing Clara would probably find useful even if she didn't know it yet. James would manage the cattle with the competence of a young man who has been doing it alongside his father since he could sit a horse and has absorbed more than he knows. William would wake up, find his blocks, and begin again. The sorghum would wait for spring, as it always did in the dark good earth of the Texas plain, patient as everything that grows. The Garrison place was home, the way a thing becomes home not when you first arrive in it, but when you have spent enough days there that the shape of it is in your body. In the way your foot knows the third porch board has a soft spot, in the way you recognize the particular creak of the east gate in a north wind, in the way the kitchen smells of coffee and wood smoke in a manner that has nothing to do with this specific morning, and everything to do with the accumulated mornings that preceded it. Piled up and permanent, yours. It had started with a man walking through a courthouse door, with the truth spoken plainly in a room where the truth had been scheduled to lose. With the gavel and the dust motes and the changed verdict and a meal at the Millhaven chop house and a letter written by lamplight at a kitchen table after a child was asleep. It had grown into this, two people and their children and their land and their cattle and their sorghum and their accumulated years, building something on the Texas plain that would outlast the building of it, the way good things do. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.